The match flickered in the darkness of the basement laboratory. Professor Louis Fezer held it steady, watching as the small sample of jellied gasoline caught fire. What happened next defied expectation. The flames didn't burst outward like ordinary fuel. Instead, they clung to the surface, burning with stubborn intensity, refusing to be extinguished. It was February 14th, 1942, deep beneath Harvard University's Converse laboratory. The date itself felt almost symbolic. Valentine's Day, a day associated with creation and passion. What Fezer had created would soon reshape warfare itself. The chemist scribbled notes in his laboratory journal with meticulous care. Aluminum naphthenite and aluminum palmitate. The compounds had transformed the liquid into something remarkable, a consistency resembling applesauce at first, then gradually thickening into something approaching rubber. He set down his pen and reached for the secure telephone. The man was 42 years old, an organic chemistry professor who understood the implications of what burned before him. This discovery would fundamentally alter how war would be fought in the Pacific. He envisioned a weapon capable of penetrating the deepest cave systems, breaching even the strongest bunkers, destroying targets that ordinary explosives couldn't touch. Fezer couldn't have known that this Valentine's Day experiment would eventually lead to the most catastrophic incendiary campaign in all of military history. The Pacific War had already taught the Americans a harsh truth. Japanese defenders refused to surrender. They retreated underground instead, fortified their positions, and fought from locations that conventional weapons proved powerless against. The volcanic islands dotting the Pacific Ocean presented perfect defensive terrain. Engineers had carved passages through solid rock, constructed bunkers reinforced with coral, dug underground networks stretching mile after mile. Iwo Jima alone contained approximately 11 miles of interconnected underground fortifications. Okinawa's defenders had converted ancient burial tombs into firing positions for machine guns. Conventional bombs simply bounced off these hardened targets. Artillery shells barely scratched the surface. American commanders faced a grim reality. Something entirely new was required. Something capable of reaching into those depths where Japanese soldiers waited in darkness. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. A Harvard chemistry professor had originally been working on synthetic rubber when the war interrupted his research. This same man had initially resisted developing poison gas, but patriotic duty had overcome his moral reservations. Louis Frederick Fezer had been born in Columbus, Ohio, on April 7, 1899. He had spent years of his academic career synthesizing vitamin K and researching blood coagulation. Now he would become the architect of modern incendiary warfare. The first practical test took place on July 4, 1942, not in some remote military installation, but on Harvard's soccer field, positioned between the business school and the stadium. Fezer carefully measured 45 pounds of his experimental compound and placed it into a shallow pool of water. Cambridge fire departments stationed themselves nearby, tense and watchful. Tennis players on adjacent courts remained oblivious to what was about to unfold. The white phosphorus igniter sparked the substance into life. Flaming globs of gel erupted skyward, then splashed into the water where they continued their relentless burning. The tennis players yelped and scattered in alarm. The gel adhered to everything it contacted. Water couldn't suppress it. The temperatures soared between 800 and 1200 degrees Celsius. Fezer's calculations proved devastatingly accurate. His creation burned 6 times hotter than thermite. Unlike gasoline, which exploded in a massive fireball, this substance projected in a focused stream that could be directed into cave openings, bunker apertures, pillboxes. The aluminum soap compounds gave it an adhesive quality. It clung to surfaces, to uniforms, to skin. Standard incendiary bombs achieved kills in perhaps 1 attack out of 60 during early trials. This new weapon achieved success in 1 out of 3 attempts. The statistics were compelling, yet the chemistry was what truly revolutionized everything. Production commenced almost immediately at Neville Deck's Products. By mid-April 1942, they had formulated a brown dry powder that appeared harmless enough. Mixed with gasoline, however, it transformed into something terrifying. The Chemical Warfare Service placed orders for thousands of tons. Dow Chemical accelerated production significantly. By 1943, America was manufacturing 500,000 pounds monthly. By 1944, production had surged to 8 million pounds annually. The M69 incendiary bomb was engineered specifically for deploying this substance. Each bomb weighed 6.2 pounds and contained the gelled gasoline designed to spread across a 15-foot diameter. 38 M69s were packed into an E-46 cluster bomb. When dropped from altitude, the cluster separated at 2,000 feet, distributing individual bombs across the target zone. Napalm first saw combat in Europe during August 1943, deployed during the Allied invasion of Sicily. Its true test, however, would come against Japanese fortifications that had proven immune to conventional attack. July 22, 1944, Tinian Island in the Mariana Chain marked the Pacific debut. Captain Robert Johnson of the 2nd Marine Division observed Army Air Force fighter bombers approaching from the east. These aircraft carried no ordinary ordnance. They were loaded with the first napalm weapons being used in the Pacific theater. The incendiary gel, shipped in secret from Hawaii, was about to be tested against an enemy that had elevated defense into a sophisticated art form. The Japanese garrison commanding Tinian, led by Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata, had invested months preparing elaborate defensive works. The 50th Infantry Regiment and associated units, totaling nearly 9,000 men, had excavated caves into the island's coral cliffs. Machine gun positions covered every possible approach. Artillery sat hidden in reverse slope positions, immune to naval bombardment. When the first napalm bombs fell on Tinian, Marines watching from Saipan, merely 6 miles distant, witnessed something they had never seen before. Instead of sharp explosions characteristic of high explosive bombs, orange flames rolled across Japanese fortifications like an enormous tidal wave of fire. The incendiary mixture penetrated cave openings, flowed into bunkers, seeped through firing slits. Japanese soldiers who had endured weeks of naval bombardment fled their positions, their uniforms burning. The burning petroleum stuck to everything. Stop, drop, and roll only spread the flames further. Water from canteens caused it to splatter more violently. The only option was complete evacuation. Marine Corporal James Chen, observing through binoculars, recorded his observations in his diary. "The Japanese came out of holes we didn't even know existed," he wrote. "They rolled in the dirt trying to extinguish it, but the fire just kept burning." Within days, Marine units were requesting napalm strikes before every offensive movement. Japanese fortifications that had required hours of costly assault to neutralize were suddenly cleared in minutes. Tinian fell on August 1st. Of the 9,000 Japanese defenders, only 313 survived. Success on Tinian was merely the beginning. On Saipan, Marine flame tank operators discovered that portable flamethrowers produced comparable effects at close range. The M2 flamethrower could project thickened fuel up to 40 yards. The operators, however, carrying 70 pounds of fuel on their backs, experienced casualty rates exceeding 90% once they revealed their position. Navy Seabees solved this problem by modifying Sherman tanks with CBH-1 flamethrowers. Marines called these Zippo tanks. They could project liquid fire up to 150 yards while providing armor protection for operators. 8 such tanks landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. What transpired would reveal napalm's terrifying capability against the most heavily fortified positions across the entire Pacific. February 23, 1945, Iwo Jima, the volcanic inferno. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams crept toward a Japanese pillbox, dragging his M2 flamethrower through volcanic ash. His unit had been halted by interlocking fields of fire from concrete emplacements. Artillery had failed. Naval gunfire had accomplished nothing. Conventional assault would mean suicide. Williams spotted the barrel of a Japanese Type 92 machine gun protruding from a firing slit. Bullets sparked against the steel tanks mounted on his back. 20 yards, 15 yards. At 10 yards, he triggered the igniter. A stream of thickened fuel shot through the firing slit. The bunker transformed into a furnace. Internal temperatures exceeded those of a crematorium in mere seconds. The concrete itself began fracturing from thermal shock. Steel reinforcement bars warped and bent. The machine gun barrel turned cherry red, then white, then began melting. No one inside could have survived more than seconds. Williams crawled toward the next position, an underground complex connected by passages. He discovered a ventilation shaft barely 6 inches wide. The flamethrower nozzle fit perfectly. One trigger pull sent flaming gel flowing through the entire system. Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden exits 50 yards away, their bodies engulfed in flames that couldn't be extinguished. In 4 hours, Williams neutralized 7 major fortifications. Positions that had stopped an entire Marine regiment were cleared by a single man with a flamethrower. He would eventually receive the Medal of Honor, but the true hero was the weapon he carried. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander on Iwo Jima, had spent a year transforming the island into a fortress. His defensive philosophy was straightforward. Make the Americans pay for every single yard with blood. His 21,000 troops had excavated miles of passages through solid volcanic rock. They had stockpiled food, water, and ammunition for a prolonged siege lasting weeks. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics carefully, understood their dependence on superior firepower. He positioned his defenses on reverse slopes where naval guns couldn't reach them. He prohibited suicidal banzai charges, instead ordering his men to fight from fortified positions until death claimed them. He believed he had constructed an impregnable defense. He had not accounted for napalm. The modified Sherman tanks arrived on the second day of battle. Captain Frank Caldwell of the 26th Marines watched the first Zippo tank advance on an underground fortress that had resisted 2 full days of assault. The tank's flamethrower erupted, sending a stream of burning petroleum 100 yards into the cave mouth. The incendiary mixture flowed like water, discovering every passage, every chamber, every hiding place. The whole mountain seemed to exhale smoke, Caldwell reported, and then we heard the screaming. Japanese soldiers emerged from caves, their clothing and skin ablaze. Those who escaped were cut down by Marine riflemen. Those who remained inside were incinerated. The subterranean complex, which military planners had estimated would require a week to clear, was neutralized in 20 minutes. The 8 flame tanks on Iwo Jima consumed 10,000 gallons of thickened fuel every single day. Each tank required a support team of Seabees for maintenance and refueling. Electrician's mate, Joseph Kissel, and shipfitter J.T. Patterson worked without rest to keep the weapons operational, frequently under enemy fire. The psychological impact proved immediate and profound. Japanese soldiers who had fought fearlessly against conventional weapons fled at the mere sight of flame tanks. Radio intercepts revealed mounting panic in Japanese communications. Words like demon fire and dragon tanks appeared in decoded messages. Private Toshio Yamada, one of the few Japanese survivors of Iwo Jima, later testified to what he had witnessed. "We were trained to die for the emperor," he explained. "We were prepared for bullets, shells, even bayonets. But the fire was something else entirely. It came into our caves like a living thing. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't hide from it. It found everyone." By March 1945, napalm had proven so devastatingly effective that General Curtis LeMay made a decision that would reshape the entire course of the war. If incendiary gel could clear caves and bunkers, what could it accomplish against cities? The struggle had consumed months. Lame grappled with the brutal mathematics of precision bombing at extreme altitudes. Jet streams flowing across Japan became invisible enemies, constantly nudging bombers away from their targets. Below, thick blankets of cloud obscured what little the bombardiers could actually see. Anti-aircraft fire erupting at 30,000 feet proved devastatingly accurate. The results were catastrophic. When Lame assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, the weight of failure pressed down on him. He understood one fundamental truth: continue with conventional tactics and he would be relieved of duty. The arithmetic of destruction told a different story. A single incendiary cluster could obliterate an area spanning 100 feet by 300 feet. Tokyo's residential districts, packed together densely, constructed almost entirely of wood, paper walls, and straw matting. Japanese war production relied on thousands of small factories embedded throughout these neighborhoods. What precision bombing couldn't reach, area bombing might annihilate. Lame made his decision. He stripped the B-29s of their defensive guns, freeing space for additional ordnance. His orders were unconventional: fly at night, descend to between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, abandon the altitude advantage they'd always relied upon. Lower altitude meant improved accuracy and placed them beneath the effective reach of Japanese anti-aircraft defenses. Just after midnight on March 10th, Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Tokyo. They marked the target, a residential section measuring 3 by 4 miles, home to 750,000 people. The main force followed, unleashing 1,665 tons of incendiaries in streams that formed a lethal grid. Within 30 minutes, individual fires merged into something far more terrible: a firestorm. The ground reached temperatures approaching molten lava. Superheated air generated winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, sucking oxygen from bomb shelters while drawing fresh air into the inferno, feeding the flames with new fuel. Concrete boiled, steel melted. The Sumida River transformed into steam. Fire Captain Susumu Takahashi of the Tokyo Fire Department logged his final entry at 12:48 in the morning. Fire beyond control. Equipment useless. The city is dying. Tokyo's fire service fielded 8,000 men and 1,000 pieces of equipment, yet possessed only 3 ladder trucks capable of reaching beyond 30 feet. They had prepared for conventional bombing, standard fires. Nothing could have prepared them for this. The incendiary gel adhered to their equipment, melted their hoses, transformed their water into scalding steam. By dawn, 16 square miles lay incinerated. Conservative death estimates stood at 87,500, though Japanese sources claimed over 100,000 perished. More people died in the Tokyo firestorm than would perish in either atomic bombing. 1 million more wandered homeless through the ash. B-29 tailgunner Sergeant James Cranks reported witnessing the aftermath. At 5,000 feet, you could smell the burning flesh. The thermal updrafts from that fire were so powerful they threw our 65-ton bomber around like a leaf. But Lame was far from finished. The systematic incineration of Japan had just begun. March 11th brought Nagoya's destruction. 313 B-29s erased the Mitsubishi aircraft engine plant and surrounding districts. 2 days later, Osaka's industrial heart burned for 72 hours. March 16th saw Kobe's port facilities and shipyards transformed into twisted metal and ash. Within 10 days, incendiary raids had obliterated more Japanese industrial capacity than 2 years of conventional bombing had achieved. The Air Force consumed napalm faster than American factories produced it. Emergency production facilities were established. By June 1945, monthly output reached unprecedented levels. Tactical lessons learned from cave clearing in the islands were being applied strategically across Japan itself. April 1st, 1945, marked the beginning of the final crucible at Okinawa. If Iwo Jima had been hell, Okinawa was something worse entirely. The island's 450,000 civilians found themselves caught between 100,000 Japanese defenders and 180,000 American attackers. The Japanese had fortified everything. Tombs, caves, hillsides, all transformed into defensive bastions. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushigima had learned hard lessons from Iwo Jima. His troops dug deeper, fortified stronger, and prepared methodically for flame attack. They installed water reservoirs inside caves, created fire breaks through passages, and fashioned crude protective gear from wet cloth and mud. It proved insufficient. The 713th Tank Battalion had been entirely converted to flame tanks for this campaign. 54 Sherman tanks, equipped with flamethrowers capable of projecting incendiary streams 60 to 80 yards downrange. Naval chemical units had prepared 250,000 gallons of thickened fuel. Every Marine Rifle Company had flamethrower teams attached. One ridge demonstrated napalm's evolution as a tactical weapon. Japanese defenders had constructed interlocking fortifications on reverse slopes, positions unreachable by artillery or air attack. Marines of the 1st Division spent 3 days advancing just 100 yards, suffering terrible casualties. On May 14th, they implemented an innovative tactic. Marines hauled barrels of the incendiary mixture to the ridgetop, punctured them with rifle fire, and rolled them downslope into Japanese positions. White phosphorus grenades ignited the flowing gel. The entire ridge became a cauldron of flame. Defensive works that had resisted for days were cleared in hours. Private First Class Eugene Sledge witnessed the attack and wrote, "The Japanese came running out of caves we didn't know existed, their clothes and bodies on fire." Some tried to surrender, but it was too late. The napalm had already done its work. They collapsed after a few steps, the fire still burning even after they were dead. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians proved devastating. Thousands had sheltered in caves following military instructions. When flame tanks approached, they faced an impossible choice: burn in the caves or emerge into machine gun fire. On May 30th, Marines discovered a cave containing 450 civilians near Shuri Castle. Lieutenant John Stevens of the 6th Marine Division attempted to convince them to surrender. When they refused, military necessity prevailed. The flame tank crew issued 3 warnings in Japanese. Receiving no response, the flamethrower ignited, sending its lethal stream deep into the cave system. Stevens testified afterward, "We could hear them screaming for 5 minutes, then silence. When we finally entered, we found mostly women and children. The flames had consumed all the oxygen. Most had suffocated before the fire reached them. It was a mercy, I suppose." The Army Chemical Warfare Service documented every engagement. Flame tanks on Okinawa consumed 200,000 gallons of thickened petroleum. Underground fortresses that would have required weeks to clear with conventional weapons were neutralized in hours. Japanese bastions that had stopped entire divisions fell to flame tank sections. Yet the cost in civilian lives was staggering. Estimates suggest flame weapons were responsible for at least 20,000 civilian deaths on Okinawa. Though exact figures remain disputed, the weapon developed to save American lives proved indiscriminate in its destruction. Colonel Unmarked's flamethrower group had expanded from a handful of personnel to a major military organization. Production facilities in Hawaii operated continuously, graduating hundreds of flame tank operators monthly. American industrial capacity had transformed a laboratory discovery into mass production. By summer 1945, the transformation was complete. The Pacific War had become a conflagration. July and August 1945 marked the air campaign's climax. Lame's B-29s conducted incendiary raids with mechanical precision. The target list expanded from major cities to smaller industrial towns. Intelligence identified 180 Japanese urban areas suitable for firebombing. By late July, 67 cities had been attacked with varying degrees of destruction. Some lost entire districts, others suffered damage to key industrial areas. The scope of destruction defied comprehension. Each B-29 carried 40 cluster bombs. A 300-plane raid could deliver nearly 500,000 individual incendiary devices. Every bomb created a pool of flame 15 feet in diameter that burned for 6 minutes at temperatures capable of melting aluminum. Japanese firefighting doctrine had completely collapsed. Throughout July, city after city fell to the flames. Fukui lost 60% of its urban area on July 19th. Matsuyama saw 3/4 consumed on July 26th. Sue suffered 85% destruction on July 28th. The systematic campaign continued with industrial efficiency. Each raid perfected techniques learned from previous ones. Japanese industrial production plummeted. Workers refused to enter factories, knowing they were targets. Transportation systems collapsed as rail yards burned. Food distribution failed as warehouses turned to ash. The home front that had sustained Japan's war effort for 4 years was dying beneath cascading waves of petroleum flame. Former Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe wrote in his diary, "The Americans have found our weakness. We built a nation of wood and paper. Now they are burning it down city by city. There is no defense against this demon fire." The Japanese military attempted countermeasures. They created fire breaks by demolishing entire city blocks. They built underground shelters with multiple exits. They distributed primitive protective equipment made from treated cloth. None worked. The burning petroleum found its way into every shelter, every hiding place, every refuge. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading physicist, was tasked with developing defenses. His report to the Imperial General Headquarters proved bleak. The gel's adhesive properties make it impossible to remove once ignited. Its combustion temperature exceeds our material's tolerance. The only defense is to prevent the enemy from delivering it. Since we have lost air superiority, there is no defense. August 1st, 1945, brought preparations for invasion. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was scheduled for November. Military planners studied hard lessons from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese defensive preparations on Kyushu were extensive. Intelligence identified 10,000 caves, 5,000 bunkers, and elaborate underground networks. Conventional assault would exact an estimated 1 million American casualties. The solution lay in incendiary warfare on an unprecedented scale. Plans called for 75 flame tank battalions, over 4,000 tanks. Chemical units would stockpile 5 million gallons of thickened fuel. Every rifle company would receive organic flamethrower squads. B-29s would conduct rolling firebombings ahead of ground forces. Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson gave flame tank production priority, matching the Manhattan Project itself. The entire industrial capacity of America was being mobilized to manufacture incendiary weapons. But the invasion would never come. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a flash consumed Hiroshima. 70,000 people died in that single instant. The world recoiled in horror at what one bomb could do to an entire city in a heartbeat. But Curtis LeMay saw things differently. He was unimpressed. His firebombing campaigns had already ravaged 67 Japanese cities, leaving many of them in ruins beyond recognition. The destruction was staggering, widespread, systematic. Tokyo alone had paid a far heavier price in human lives than Hiroshima ever would. Yes, the atomic bomb was visually spectacular, dramatic in a way that captured the world's imagination. Yet the incendiary raids his forces had conducted month after month had inflicted greater cumulative damage across the entire nation. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki disappeared in atomic fire. Another city obliterated, another devastating flash that shocked the world. But that very same night, 95 B-29 bombers dropped conventional incendiary bombs on Yawata. The resulting conflagration raged for 2 full days, flames climbing skyward, consuming everything in their path. On August 14th, the bombing continued relentlessly. Even as Japanese officials sat at tables discussing the terms of surrender, 160 B-29s descended on Kumagaya and Isizaki with their deadly cargo. The fires burned on through the night while diplomats negotiated the end of the war. August 15th arrived. Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender to his people. In his address, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, referring pointedly to the atomic weapons. Yet he made no mention of the weapon that had truly devastated his nation more thoroughly than any other instrument of war. The numbers were staggering. Between March and August of 1945, incendiary bombing had destroyed 180 square miles across 67 different cities. Between 300,000 and 500,000 civilians lay dead. 8 million more had lost their homes entirely. 40% of Japan's industrial capacity had been eliminated. A 1946 report by the National Defense Research Council revealed that 40,000 tons of M69 incendiary bombs had rained down on Japan throughout the entire conflict. The Pacific War had not ended with a blinding atomic flash. It had ended with the slow, consuming burn of countless fires across an island nation. Professor Louis Feza returned to Harvard after the war, back to the chemistry laboratory where everything had begun. He had received the Medal of Merit, his nation's highest civilian honor. His invention, everyone said, had shortened the war. It had saved countless American lives. It had transformed the very nature of warfare itself. Yet victory tasted bitter in his mouth. In 1967, as the Vietnam War raged on television screens across America, Feza watched footage of napalm strikes. Children fled down roads, their bodies engulfed in flames. Villages disappeared in infernos. The weapon he had developed for destroying fortifications and structures was now being used against civilians in populated areas. By June of 1972, Feza could remain silent no longer. He wrote directly to President Nixon, urging him to push for an international ban on napalm. "When we developed this compound, we never imagined it would be used against people," he explained. "We were thinking of military structures, of fortifications, of targets. I do not have the right to judge the morality of napalm simply because I invented it, but I firmly believe its use must be restricted." Nixon's science advisor, Edward David Jr., responded with a reply that essentially dismissed the plea. He noted that napalm use was difficult to control and predict, offering only that the suggestion would be given careful attention. Feza understood it for what it was, a polite brush-off, nothing more. He died in 1977, his life coming to an end. When his obituary appeared in Harvard's Gazette, it mentioned his groundbreaking work on vitamin K and his research into anti-malarial drugs. There was no reference to napalm. The university had made a deliberate choice to erase the weapon from his official record, to excise it from his legacy as though it had never existed. The revolution in warfare had been complete. The age of static fortifications had ended. No concrete bunker could withstand burning rivers of fuel. No cave, no matter how deep, could provide refuge from the incendiary deluge. Those volcanic fortresses scattered across the Pacific Islands, carved from solid rock and defended by soldiers willing to die rather than surrender, had finally fallen to a weapon mixed together in a Harvard basement. The 703rd Tank Battalion was deactivated in 1946. The flame tanks were cut apart, their specialized equipment destroyed or melted down. The construction battalion men who had modified them returned to their ordinary lives as civilians. The flamethrower group organized by Colonel Unmacht was disbanded. Its records were sealed and classified away. The veterans who had witnessed what these weapons could do rarely spoke about their experiences. Corporal Raymond Hart, who had fought on Iwo Jima with the Marines, would say only that the flamethrowers got the job done. Woody Williams, the last Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima still living, devoted his post-war years to supporting Gold Star families, choosing never to discuss the weapon that had made him famous. Eugene Sledge, who survived the Pacific Campaign, wrote his reflections on what he had seen. "We thought the Japanese soldiers were cruel," he recalled. "Then we brought the flamethrowers. War turns everyone into monsters. The military lessons were unmistakable. Technology had triumphed over human determination. Chemistry had defeated raw courage. The capacity to produce weapons on an industrial scale had proven more decisive than warrior spirit and tradition." The samurai code that had sustained Japanese culture for centuries burned away in those petroleum flames. Every major military power drew conclusions from what they had witnessed. Each developed their own incendiary weapons systems. International law attempted to establish boundaries around their use. In 1980, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons placed restrictions on incendiary weapons, though falling short of an outright prohibition. The weapon that had concluded one war would reappear in many conflicts to come. The scientific advances that emerged from this work produced unexpected benefits. Research into how to make gasoline adhere to targets led to discoveries in polymer chemistry, in fire suppression technologies, in novel materials. The aluminum compounds used to gelify fuel found applications in industrial processes and medical treatments. Studies of thermal effects contributed to better methods of treating burn victims. Yet the moral questions lingered unresolved. Was the firebombing of Tokyo a war crime? Could the civilian casualties on Okinawa be justified by military necessity? Did incendiary campaigns shorten the war enough to morally justify what had occurred? Historians continue wrestling with these questions without reaching consensus. In Japan, survivors established the Association of Tokyo Air Raid Victims, gathering testimonies and preserving memories for future generations. Museums in Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe display melted artifacts and photographs showing the scale of destruction, keeping lists of the dead. School children learn about the night of black snow when burning debris fell from the sky like dark rain. The transformation of warfare had run its course. The Pacific War had opened with torpedo planes at Pearl Harbor and concluded with the systematic incination of cities across an entire nation. The character of combat itself had fundamentally shifted between those two moments. Individual bravery and martial skill still mattered, certainly. But now technology and industrial production determined the outcomes of battles and ultimately of wars themselves. In the caves of Iwo Jima, scorch marks from flame tanks remain visible even after 8 decades. On Okinawa, sealed caves still contain the remains of those who chose death over facing the flames. Throughout Tokyo, memorial parks mark locations where entire neighborhoods vanished in single nights of bombing. FISA's formula was elegant in its simplicity. Aluminum naphthenate plus aluminum palmitate plus gasoline yielded napalm. The mathematics of warfare had become chemistry. The chemistry of annihilation had become an exercise in industrial production. The age of limited conflict had ended. When General Curtis LeMay stood in the ruins of Tokyo in September 1945, surveying the landscape of destruction, he reflected on what had been accomplished. "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more human beings in Tokyo on that single night than perished in the atomic flash at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined," he stated matter-of-factly. "But it was war," he continued. "They initiated it. We finished it." The Pacific Ocean had witnessed the emergence of truly modern total war, not through atomic weapons that dominated the headlines, but through a humble substance that burned with unstoppable intensity. Napalm had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare forever. A weapon created in a Harvard laboratory had claimed more Japanese lives than any other American weapon system. It had consumed a nation that believed itself protected by divine providence. The strategic bombing survey conducted after the war's conclusion reached a stark and unsettling finding. Japan would have surrendered by November 1945 regardless, the report concluded. This would have occurred even without the atomic bombs, even without Soviet entry into the Pacific conflict. The relentless systematic firebombing campaign, more than any other single factor, had destroyed Japan's capacity to continue the fight. For the scientists and engineers who developed these weapons, the psychological burden was considerable. FISA was hardly alone in carrying regrets and guilt. Many chemists and engineers who contributed to incendiary weapons spent years grappling with what their creations had wrought. The construction battalion members who had redesigned and improved the flame tanks left minimal records of their work. These men, trained as builders and engineers, had become instruments of destruction. For those Japanese who survived the bombing, the trauma persisted across generations. Young people who ran through burning streets in terror grew into adults haunted by recurring nightmares. The smell of gasoline could trigger panic attacks decades later in their lives. Burn scars mapped across their bodies served as permanent physical reminders of what they had endured. Yet from this devastation emerged an unexpected transformation. The same nation reduced to smoking ruins by American incendiary bombing would eventually become one of the strongest allies of the United States. The cities that had been consumed by flames rose again, rebuilding themselves into thriving centers of business and culture. Tokyo, which had endured the most devastating bombing campaign in history, transformed into one of the world's greatest metropolitan areas. In military academies across the globe, the Pacific firebombing campaign is studied as both a masterpiece of strategic planning and execution and as a cautionary tale regarding the true nature of total war. The integration of tactical and strategic incendiary operations demonstrated how a single weapon system could scale from destroying individual military positions to incinerating entire urban areas. Contemporary international law has attempted to address the lessons learned. The 1980 Protocol on Incendiary Weapons restricts but does not eliminate their deployment. Military considerations frequently override humanitarian objections. Within Japan, the memory of firebombing serves multiple purposes and meanings. For some Japanese citizens, it represents a warning about where militarism leads. For others, it stands as evidence of warfare's fundamental brutality and inhumanity. For most, it remains simply a profound human tragedy that should never occur again. Each year, memorial services draw fewer and fewer survivors as time passes. American memory of the firebombing remains ambiguous and complicated. The atomic bombings dominate how Americans remember that war's conclusion. The months of systematic incendiary destruction that killed greater numbers receives far less attention, relegated to footnotes in the historical record. This selective memory serves purposes. It is psychologically simpler to process 2 atomic bombs than months of steady systematic burning. The technological arc from Fisa's laboratory to the ruins of Tokyo required only 3 years. During that period, napalm evolved from a scientific novelty into the most destructive conventional weapon of the era. Today, napalm and its chemical descendants remain in military arsenals worldwide. The underlying principle remains unchanged across the decades: jellied fuel that adheres to surfaces and burns with tremendous heat. Fisa spent his final years teaching and composing chemistry textbooks together with his wife Mary. He rarely discussed napalm, preferring to emphasize his other scientific accomplishments. Yet the burden of his creation never fully departed from him. In private moments, he contemplated counterfactual histories, wondering whether different choices might have changed outcomes. These were futile questions, he understood. If not he, then someone else would have developed it. The chemistry was straightforward. The military requirement was undeniable. Industrial capacity existed to produce it. The weapon was historically inevitable once modern chemistry encountered modern warfare. The fundamental revelation that napalm's application exposed remained this: in total war, human ingenuity recognizes no boundaries when creating mechanisms of destruction. Industrial systems that improve human existence can be transformed into instruments for ending lives on massive scales. As the final survivors gradually pass away, their memories transition into historical record. The burn scars gradually fade, destroyed cities rise rebuilt, accumulated trauma finds processing and meaning. Yet the capacity for such devastation endures and persists. War ended, the flames extinguished, but the questions that napalm raised continue burning. The essential lesson proved clear. In total war, victory flows to those nations capable of manufacturing the most terrible weapons and possessing the resolute will to deploy them. Japan's fortified positions, excavated from volcanic stone and defended with fierce commitment, had collapsed before American incendiary assault. The Fortress Pacific had burned. From its ashes rose the modern age, forever altered by a weapon developed in a university building, tested on a soccer field, and ultimately deployed across an ocean of islands until it consumed an empire.